I was thinking as I was sitting listening to Judy, whom I've heard many, many times, that the sort of transition to what I want to talk to you about goes to a quote from the great Native American thinker and writer Vine Deloria, who once was in a meeting at the American Anthropological Association and said, "If you all think that anthropology is such a great tool, why don't you try it on your own society?" And so I guess my talk is really about, if you all think the brain science is so great, let's try it on ourselves as thinkers and doers in the society and look at how we think about social issues, how our thinking is occluded or is stimulated, and how we could do a better job about helping other people think better about these social issues. The work that I do at the Frameworks Institute, along with the 15 PhD level linguists, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists that work with me, is to figure out how people think about complicated social issues. So we are always in the field somewhere, talking to people, stopping them on the street. I'm going to be showing you a lot of on-the-street video in the US, in Australia, in Brazil, in the UK, in Alberta, and asking people to explain to us how kids work, what it means that they develop, how that process actually happens. And then we also work on other issues: education reform, environmental health, multi-generational issues. We've had a very large project that we're just completing on criminal and juvenile justice and on immigration. And we're just beginning a project on how people think about human services and human needs. We do a great deal of research. It's multi-method, it's multidisciplinary, and I'm not going to talk so much about the methods that we use. I'm going to try and talk today about what it is that we have found that people need to understand about early child development and about adverse childhood experiences. So I want to start with a couple of principles that I think are revealing my advocacy in this talk. So we are advocates for an empirical approach to communications. So we believe there is a science of cognition, and that you need to do original research to understand how people think about issues. You can't just put your finger up in the air and say, well, let's go try this on them. That you actually need a systematic theory and a systematic pursuit and a way to analyze data using the social and cognitive sciences. And that this derives from the notion that there are always two social problems. There is the problem that we've been talking about this morning, the actual problem of brain development and how it happens, how it unfolds, what influences it, what promotes it and derails it. But there is another problem that you are up against, which is how people actually think it happens. And that problem is as much a problem for you as coming up with the solutions to the social analysis or to the science. And so the duality of the work that you do has to be strategic right from the beginning. You have to know not only what works and how it works, but what people think about how it works and where they break down, where they're stuck. So we use an empirical approach. And we know from the theory of social movements and from the work that we do that when we are able to develop strong frames that anchor the work that we do, we also build coalitions and social movements. So social movements theory the last 20 years has been very specific about frames, that when social movements work, it's not just that the time is right or that there are resources, but that the framing of the movement has been potent, has been good, and it now becomes something that extends, that becomes sticky, that passes from people and becomes part of this generative unfolding. So stickiness is what people usually come to frameworks saying they want. We want to make our issues sticky. We want to be able to see it grow a constituency. We want to be able to talk to people in our communities. We want to be able to see them talk to other people. And our response to that is that stickiness is an empirical pursuit. It's not just making as much noise as you can. It is figuring out how to use your talents and your resources as communicators to give people what they need to get smarter about a social issue. So I'm borrowing this little recipe. I wish I'd invented it from the Heath brothers, from a book Made to Stick, which I quite like. Somebody else was talking about the Heath brothers last night. they're good social scientists. And so they invented this little recipe, which I'm going to follow in our work today. So if you want to make your issue sticky and you're not wedded to the sort of bullhorn view of the world, what you need to do is first you need to know what it is you want to say. What is the core of your message? And that sounds easy, but I think it's one of the hardest things that we do with organizations is what exactly is it that you and the experts that you pay attention to believe is now ready to go out into the public square. Second, why isn't it happening naturally? You don't need people like me if it is happening naturally, but if it isn't, why isn't it? What are the roadblocks for it infusing public discourse? Third, once you figure out what those roadblocks are, you can't just kind of sandpaper over them. You have to figure out how to break people's guessing machines. You have to figure out what it is inside their heads that is preventing them from understanding what it is you are trying to impart. And then once you've broken their guessing machines, you have to figure out how to fill it in, how to build a new way for them to be in the world, a new way for them to see their world. So I'm going to pursue this little recipe across our work on early child development and show you, when you ask these kinds of questions, how it can change the way that you practice, the way that you see yourselves as communicators. I want to start with what it is that we are supposed to be talking about. This is from our work over a decade with Jack Shonkoff and the National Scientific Council at Harvard. We sat in rooms with neuroscientists and others and tried to boil down a very simple story over time. Everyone was elated when we were finally able to come up with this little 7-part story, which is very simple and very much not a story, right? So the only good thing it has going for it here is the incipient notion of a bad guy in chronic stress, but it doesn't have a narrative. So if you were to walk out and try to engage somebody in transmitting this, you would have lots of problems. It's not memorable, one. And number two, it does not take into account all of the ways that people have of getting rid of this information. Because that is, of course, what we do in our daily life. It's not like we're walking around saying, I wonder how little kids grow. We're trying to get our own kid to school. We're trying to go on with our daily life. We're not asking these questions in ways that open us up. And so this was a very good rough draft of what we need to communicate. But now let me show you why it doesn't happen naturally. So you've probably been in this situation yourself where you get up and you want to engage a group of people and you think you're saying AAA, and all the questions that you come back sound like B, 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 B. And you say, but that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about A. And all the questions come back B, B, B. So I want to show you some examples of this drawn from, these particular on-the-street interviews are from the US, but I'll be showing you some from Alberta as well. So this lost in translation process. So you try to say, persistent stress can lead to mental health problems in children and have long-term effects on developmental outcomes. Right? A perfectly simple statement. And what you hear back is something like this.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You know, all the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it in whatever society's eyes deems success.
So we're going to talk a lot about this disconnect, the disconnect over stress, trying to talk about adverse child experiences and stress, and what people think about stress. And I pulled this video because it is a strong cultural model that people have, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So that's part of the AABB. You think you're going to talk to people about persistent stress, and what you're getting back is, yeah, bring it on. Let's get some more in front of kids so that they can toughen up. Let's look at another one. Child mental health problems are very common, and the onset of major mental illness can occur as young as age 7.
Well, the memory of a human doesn't start till 3 years old, as we all know.
You don't get problems and mental problems until you're older.
But children don't get influences.
So confusion of memory, identifiable sort of cognitive memory with mental health or mental illness. Aging up the child. I can only deal with this if I get the child old enough that I can imagine them having a mind. And then my personal favorite, children don't get influences. So you wonder, what is that person saying? And what we'll see as we look at what we call the swamp of cultural models available to people, that swampy thinking of the things that they've inhaled over time, is that because people see very young children as sponges, they do not see them in the interactive way that was reflected in the way that you built brain architecture. It's easy for them to see that they grow up sort of in the sink of the family, and nothing outside really influences. They're there protected, and by the time, sort of overt cognitive functioning comes online, then they are exactly what they've been. They are these sort of sponges. So this is a problem, right? For the kind of work that you want to do, this is just a little couple of snippets of the kinds of things you are likely to get back from your communities, your boards, from ordinary people when you begin to engage them in this conversation. And the reason that you have this problem is that something is translating, but it isn't you. And what is translating are the way that people have learned and inhaled these issues over time. It's a quote from Deborah Tannen, a linguist at Georgetown University, which I quite like the way she said it, that people are not blank slates. They are veterans of perception. They have thought about their world. They have modeled their world like dutiful little economists. They have figured out sort of what things happen and how they affect each other. And they have stored these things in mind. And when they get new information, they pull up these packages of things, schemas, and these cultural models map on to that incoming information. And as she says, the world being a systematic place confirms these expectations, saving us the time of figuring things out anew each time. So if you really understand this quote, you change the way you do communications. You fundamentally cannot go back to a clipboard model. You cannot go back to, let's just get their attention. You realize that you're going to have to deal with those stored ways of thinking that people have internalized over time. So we call this mapping the swamp. We'd like to say to people that they aren't blank vessels, they're swamp. They're swampy thinking. And the good thing about swamps is some things are bad, right? You've got alligators and other stuff, but some parts of the swamp are good. It's an ecology. And so your job is to figure out what you want to push back and what you want to pull forward from the way that people have learned to think about an issue. So when we map the swamp, we do something like this. This is the map of developmental outcomes and resilience. I'll just briefly go around here. So what we find is that people believe that negative outcomes are the exception because children are on a sort of self-makingness trajectory. It would be unusual for them to be derailed. If they are derailed, it's largely because of issues like they didn't get the right nutrition, they weren't put in a safe environment, or they didn't have enough activities, not quality of activities, but enough activities. If there are positive outcomes, that's the norm. If you follow directions, it's like making a cake. School performance and confidence and lots of activities become the difference. And so we'll talk about how sketchy, how shallow this understanding is compared to what you dealt with as you built your brains, and how we need to crack this aspect of swampy thinking. If children have influences, they are in the family, that parental behavior explains all individual differences, that resilience is an innate substance that everyone is born with and you either use it or lose it. And so if you are not resilient, it is largely your fault because you have not taken advantage of the multiple stressors that have presented themselves to you to overcome, right? Here we are in willpower. No challenge or adversity is too great. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Effort explains individual differences, and resilience is yours if you want it. And so down here is something good. Context matters. This is what needs to be pulled forward. But people have a very, very sketchy understanding of how community gets in the child. So how do outside influences begin to manifest themselves in children's outcomes? And that sketchiness is just as sketchy whether we're talking about Canada, the US, Australia, the UK, and to some extent in Brazil. Although the Brazilians are not quite as fixated on the toxic stress, they actually don't believe that stress is ever good for you. So there are some cultural differences. If we were doing this for Alberta, interestingly enough, we would also add that government has a role, a strong role, and an expectation from the public to deliver services that would help children. We would not see that in the US. So I want you to keep in mind this swamp, and now I want to show you swampy thinking on the streets of the US. I could have done a reel for Alberta, but I'll do one later. And I want you to think about how these things come up over and over again in the way that people talk. So this is a type of method that we use. We stop people on the street corners all over various countries. We ask them an open-ended question. Can you explain to us how children develop? And then later on, I'll show you we introduce some frame elements to see if we can get a different response by giving them a little bit more heft to think about. But these are open-ended questions.
Why is it that some kids turn out okay, you think, and others don't? You
think? Because,
Well,
That's a pretty deep question.
That's a loaded question.
That's a great question.
The difference between a child who turns out well and a child who doesn't turn out well is what?
I think a lot of it has to do with like the parents.
I think it has a lot to do with the family.
The majority of it comes from their parents.
Parents, all falls back on their parents.
So much of it starts at home.
I think it goes back again to family.
Sometimes there's no father. They do come from parents.
I feel like it has to reflect on the parents.
how do the genetics and the environment, you made this sort of gesture with your hands. Like can you put that into words?
Not really.
Your biology.
Part of it's in the gene.
Whole nature versus nurture.
Cellular karma, what genes they inherit.
But I do lean towards the nurture side more.
I think to a point, if you have screwed up parents, you're going to have screwed up kids.
Just their biology just makes them who they are.
Sometimes I actually think it's just meant to be.
So how would you explain, a situation where someone, has parents who are neglectful and yet they turn out okay?
I guess it just, I guess it just depends on your own personality and whether or not you're born with like a sort of optimism or pessimism, that sort of thing.
It's kind of, I think it's all a part of the, attitudes and temperaments.
The failures are those that choose to fail.
They have a positive attitude on life and they're trying to go up.
If you have created the mentality of a strong child, the child is not going to let anything that's bordering it stop it from progressing.
It takes a personal determination.
You know right from wrong, it's a choice they make, I think.
Willpower seems to have a lot to do with it.
I think you got to believe in yourself.
If you're strong, if your matrix is strong, not in the movie sense.
Those who choose to fail, you could choose to fail.
I just think it's all choices. I mean, really and truly, I just think it's a choice.
But if you look at, for example, media content analyses, or even if we look at the materials that organizations like yours are putting out there isn't a lot helping these people answer these questions. So they've been some pretty good learners. I mean, they've learned the old genetics. They can parrot kind of genes set in stone, but they don't have any way of updating that. Nobody is kind of bringing them along in the new brain science, and I think that is the opportunity. But the caution is that you can't just go out, with a sandwich board and say, new science, let me talk to you, because they're going to bring this on. They're going to map it on. And so understanding communications in a different way is going to be imperative to whether you're able to engage communities, your boards, etc., in this new way of thinking. So you all love theories of change. This is our theory of change. And I think it's useful because I think if you don't think about communications in the right way, you tend to make mistakes in using it as a tool. So we consider that people live and work and talk inside public discourses, that we are always talking to our friends, and we're always reading the newspaper, we're always engaged in some way of understanding the worlds around us. We are meaning makers. And we come to this with many models in mind that come out of our culture. We are daily bombarded. Just walk down a greeting card lane on Mother's or Father's Day and see how consistent it is in the way that we think of what mothers and fathers are. So this is our culture pushing back and telling us sort of how the world works. And we have absorbed these cultural models over time. And anyone that lives in that culture is exposed to these, even though we may live in multiple cultures and have other models available to us. We usually have what media sociologist George Gerbner called the drip of the mainstream culture in our heads. And what happens is that every day we are served up a new way of thinking about something. In this case, you go out and you want to engage people that stress is an important factor to consider in development. And so the process that people use to process that information is they connect it to something that is in their heads. They're rummaging around here in the swamp, to mix a metaphor, and they settle on something they know. Stress does the body good. And that complete idea that is very familiar to them blows up, and it becomes the way to process this information. It's the lens through which the information gets stuck in mind, and out comes an opinion. Kids need stress. Why would we limit it? So if you're trying to get in front of toxic stress, if you're trying to talk about adverse childhood experiences, this system is going to be your enemy. This automaticity is going to be the problem that you are up against. This is the guessing machine that you're going to have to break. And the way we break it is to figure out what is a different stimulus, what is a different way of communicating about stress that we could put in front of people that would activate a different way of thinking. And so toxic stress has been the metaphor that came out of the early frameworks work for Jack's group. And what we were able to see is that when we talked to people about toxic stress, they were able to distinguish, oh, there are different kinds of stress. Some are good and some are bad. A taxonomy of stress, which we developed. And so they were able to keep their original idea, but they were able to make differentiations. And out of there, we know from the research we did, is that there were different opinions. Bad stress can derail development. We need to limit toxic stress. Are you with me? And so if we can contest the dominant frame, and that's where you all come in, right? It's not going to be that somebody stands up on a mountain and says, you know, toxic stress is bad for you, but rather it is your legs in the community, it is you talking about toxic stress that begins to contest the dominant paradigm, that begins to be able to filter through where people say, oh no, toxic stress would be really bad and that's different, that finally end up in a changed public discourse, a widening of the discourse where we can have more discussions with people about prevention, intervention, treatment, which we can't have with those people that are stuck where they are. You can imagine saying, oh now let's talk about prevention or let's talk about intervention. They are so stuck in that ugly part of the swamp that these things do not make sense to them, literally don't make sense to them. Okay, so now we're going to have a little test in this discussion. I want you to tell me why, now that you understand that you don't feed the swamp, the bad parts of the swamp, you move away from them and you pull other things from the swamp. So tell me why this particular way of framing poverty would be problematic. What would you expect to come back from the swamp in response to making that assertion? And it puts all the attribution of responsibility, as we say, is all on the individual. Right. And there's nothing about context here, right? So let me show you one of the responses to something like this.
You're looking for that Cinderella story at that point. You're looking for the guy or the girl that came from the worst situation possible, but made the most of themselves.
So we've told people a story they already know, and they like it, right? He likes that story. He's been looking for that story because it's a very comfortable, he doesn't have to break his guessing machines. Robert Reich talks about 4 parables of American politics. This is the triumphant individual. We are literally hardwired to recognize this story, and we tell it to ourselves over and over and over again. And so that's what we're up against. Breaking the guessing machine is breaking the hold of that story, which is, I must say, as potent in Alberta as it is here. But what it does, what it should signal to you as communicators is you don't have to help this along, right? You don't have to play along with the game and further invigorate this. You don't have to make those neural connections any harder, any stronger than they are. You can opt out of this. And so this is not a good communication strategy. Another strategy that I would hope you would leave behind by now would be myths and facts. right? So here is a little myth and fact sheet put out by the CDC on flu vaccine. Why would that be a not very effective communication strategy?
Well, first of all, who reads them anymore?
But if you do, they won't remember the facts. That's right.
It reinforces the swamp.
That's right. The myths are the swamp, right? And so you just reminded me of the cognitive mistakes I am likely to make. You know, Daniel Kahneman has a great quote. He says, his system one, his automatic, thinking pilot, told his system two, his reflective brain, a story, and his system two decided to believe it. And so here, that's exactly what you've got. The myths are very comfortable and very familiar, and the facts are hard to remember. And so this, when it was tested, people remembered the myths as true. It got worse over time. Those wonky facts dropped out. And my favorite, they attributed the false information to the CDC. Gotta love it. So the way that we change this dynamic is by using frame elements. And you've heard many of them out of the mouths of Susan and Judy earlier today. And I'm going to talk specifically about metaphor today, because we don't have time to talk about the whole basket of things we use. But we use values to reorient people to think about these issues as collective, as somebody said over here, as collective issues, not simply individual issues. We use metaphors to get that sketchy understanding redirected. And we use story, because we think in story. We are storytelling animals, and so we have to tell people a complete story, or the swamp is likely to bubble up in the way that we think of things. So when we took that core story, that untranslated story from Jack and the neuroscientists, as it passed through public thinking, it looked something like this. So it was like the neuroscientists were saying parents are important, environment is important, free will, motivation is important, genes are important. And out of it comes a successful or an unsuccessful child, and there's no way that people were able to explain what happened in that mechanism. So this is not uncommon in social problems, but this signals that all of the attention needs to go on filling the black box, on giving some explanatory depth so that people understand how something works. Because when they understand how something works, they become much more impervious to false information and to the swamp. And so we filled this over time with things like brain architecture, toxic stress, effectiveness factors, etc., and used values to signal to people that the outcome is not simply one child or one family, but it is society's purview as well. And the attention that we spent on this was in the middle dimension. It was solving this about, then a miracle happens. Out comes a successful child or an unsuccessful child. And we did that using metaphor. And so metaphor is your friend. You've all been using metaphors all day today, whether you realized or not. It's like the bourgeois gentilhomme saying, I'm now speaking in prose. I've been speaking in prose all my life. You've all been speaking in metaphors all day, even when you talked about pruning. Pruning is a metaphor. Scientists use metaphors all the time, because how else would you engage non-scientists in thinking about these things? And so when we use metaphors, we use something that is in people's everyday world that they know a lot about. We know a lot about tables. We know a lot about chairs and toasters and cups and roadways. And we map everything they know onto this strange socio-political issue that they don't know much about. And we see if we can take all the knowledge that they have of these concrete objects and use it to fill in. So we call these explanatory metaphors. People use metaphors for other reasons. They use metaphors to tar their opposition, as we are seeing in the current Congress. But these are explanations that are actually designed to explain things. They're simple, they're visual, so you'll see people going like this, and we show you some video, you'll see them embodying the metaphor. That's a very strong way that they learn it. They show how something works. It is generative. They can begin to think using the metaphor, and it seems appropriate to them. It seeps into their conversation without their saying, to their buddy, I'm now going to tell you a metaphor. And we test these metaphors in very complicated ways. on the street interviews like the one I showed you, where we stop people and we teach them a metaphor and we compare their before and after responses by coding the video. We do them in large N surveys. I should say that our work on early child development now probably has 50,000 informants across all of these methods. So it's a very robust set of work. So we run candidate metaphors against each other in large N surveys. We then teach people the metaphors in groups of 2 and have them teach them to 2 other people and have them to teach them to other people and see if they can hold up. So this simulates your process of wanting to go into community. You can't teach everyone a new way of thinking about adverse childhood experiences, right? And so you're going to have to rely upon people to convey it to each other, and we test it for that, and I'll show you some video from there. And then finally, we teach it to people like you, experts, and we watch you teach it to ordinary people, and we see what you may struggle to do, and we tweak the metaphor to make sure that it's working. Now, I've spent a lot of time on this bit of methodology because usually we have a problem at this point where people suddenly say, oh my God, metaphor is the key to everything. I love metaphors. I can make up much better metaphors than those stupid frameworks people. Paula Tyler at Norleen being a case in point, she came up to me and she said, a child is like a loaf of bread. I said, Paula, don't go there. No. And so I want to show you just a little clip to dampen your metaphor enthusiasm on why you need a tested metaphor.
Oh, I don't like you. I think you're a fake cop. If we were in the wild, I would attack you. If I were a lion and you were a tuna, I would swim out in the middle of the ocean and eat you.
Okay, first off, a lion swimming in the ocean? Lions don't like water. If you'd placed it near a river or some sort of fresh water source, that makes sense. But you find yourself in the ocean, 20-foot waves, I'm assuming it's off the coast of South Africa, coming up against a full-grown 800-pound tuna with his 20 or 30 friends, you lose that battle. You lose that battle 9 times out of 10. Did that go the way you thought it was going to go? Nope.
So the point really is that we go through a lot of work to pre-flight these metaphors so that you can feel pretty comfortable that when you're going to use them, you're going to get better responses than you would from the thing you rolled out of bed and made up that morning, or from just engaging in the sort of swampy thinking. So I want to talk about stress and what it does. So when we invented this metaphor, it's actually a taxonomy, so it allowed people to keep their idea of positive stress. It allowed them to learn about toxic stress, which they knew sort of incipiently but didn't have a strong identity for. And perhaps most important, and I think you saw it in your games, was to understand how conditional tolerable stress is, that these things are amenable to intervention, that they can be buffered, that there are things, that this is not raw determinism, that there are things communities can do to change the outcomes here. So I want to show you Albertans talking about toxic stress. And so first I'll show you that man on the street where we just asked them to talk to us about how early child development happens. And then the same man has just gotten literally a 30-second introduction to toxic stress and is asked to talk to us a little bit further.
So if you were to try to kind of describe what development is, what would you say?
The growth.
Growth. Elaborate. Like, what do you mean by growth? Like, just getting bigger?
Well, changing. As a child develops, the more sustained negative influences that they have, whether it be violence, poverty, whatnot, the more damage it's going to do to their long-term growth.
So I think children learn by response. So if they're neglected for maybe a day, that won't affect their whole entire life. But if they're neglected for the first few years of life, it will affect them.
Their entire mental development is not going to go through the way it should. It's not going to completely develop. Because they're not given the outlets needed to do so. They're not given the right properties. They don't have the foundation to go off of that.
It makes sense, right? Like toxic does make sense to people. And I think if there's some definition or some clarity around it, I think it really could work in linking into how this toxicity or these pieces really impact development.
Okay.
And how stress, linked in with stress, because stress has huge impacts as well, right? So linking it in, everybody knows what stress is, but maybe not how it affects children. So linking the two together, I think it would work.
So I think one of the things I'd like to leave you with overall is that you can get people there. You can make people smarter. Don't give up when you get swampy thinking back. It's not that people are, you know, vile, ill-intentioned people who live in, you know, red, blue, or purple states. It's that they really don't have a fundamental mechanism that they can draw upon to explain these complex scientific phenomena. Moreover, they are getting dosed with this every single day. So here's a cover of Reader's Digest a few years ago. Dr. Phil, the childhood traumas that made him so strong. It's a story about Dr. Phil's father, who was an alcoholic. This is not a good way of engaging people in contesting that dominant thought about toxic stress. If you start to look for the way that the culture understands stress, you will see it everywhere. I literally was reading a sports page the other day. It was about the UCLA Cal Berkeley game, and it talked about one of the quarterbacks had had some severe stress applied to him, but he was going to pull himself up by the bootstrap and be able to overcome it in this game. Now, that was about positive and tolerable stress, but only if you had a taxonomy of stress would you process it that way. Otherwise, you would have added that to your little baggage heap of how stress works and said, oh, he's got to have gumption and willpower and he's going to overcome that. So these ideas are contested in our culture, and you all need to be part of those frame contests. That is part of what advocates do, is to walk ideas into the public square and to give people ways to be smarter in their roles as citizens. And what we know from this kind of work is that you can, right? So here's the Harvard Center promulgating the working papers and the videos on brain architecture, serve and return, and toxic stress. Here's Google Trends. This is when we started talking about toxic stress years ago. And look, we're out in the discourse. We're effectively contesting it. It is being passed on. And as a result of that, we see people coming on board. Academy of Peds now has made toxic stress an important part of its policy priorities. We've seen toxic stress included in the language of legislation. And so it is out there as an idea to begin to contest this dominant paradigm, to begin to pull people back to see that stress can be a negative thing in children's lives and is something that we can address and control. Now, what we've done over time is to create a narrative. So frameworks often looks at narrative structure. What is it people are asking, and then fills it in with these metaphors and other devices. So we've gone back and said, why are other people's children my concern, and tested these ways of framing that, values here. What actually develops brain architecture, the air traffic control system that you heard about this morning. How does it work? Children grow up in an environment of experiences. The environment edits the genetic structure, what can be done, etc. And now we've filled in the bad guy in the narrative because people didn't know that. They didn't have what disrupts development, so we've filled it in. So that's a very good contribution to the story that you want to tell, but it's not enough, right? It's the beginning point, but it has yet to fill out this narrative so that people can begin to counter that swampy thinking about why one child would do well and another wouldn't. And so what we have to be able to do is to take this narrative structure that people are telling themselves, that strong children create strong families, which create strong communities, and reverse these arrows. We have to be able to show them how communities shape the outcomes in families, which in turn shape children, or as the California Endowment said, what surrounds us shapes us. And so that's the next challenge that we took on in the last metaphor that I'll introduce you to, which is the resilience scale. So we developed a metaphor called the resilience scale, or sometimes called the outcome scale, that if you think of development as a scale, that positive factors get on one side and negative factors on the other, and the way that the scale tips is like the outcomes of development. The scale can be counterbalanced such that outcomes can still happen even when there's heavy stuff on the negative side. And importantly, for every child, the fulcrum starts in a different place, which influences how the scale works, and it makes some scales easier to counterbalance than others. And the fulcrum's not set. It can slide based on experiences over time. So can you see what the metaphor is trying to get at, what it's trying to do? It turns out people have a very expansive thinking on scales. They actually know the word fulcrum, and they can discuss it. Yeah, no rudders, but fulcrums. And so I want to show you one of the scientists on the Scientific Council, Phil Fisher from the University of Oregon. So this is getting an exposure to resilience scale and trying to think how he wants to use it to explain the work that he's doing. And all he got is a brief, sort of, here, Phil, is a new metaphor. Let's try this on. Let's work on this. And this is what Phil did with it.
And so I like to think of resilience as being like a scale, the kind of scale that you weigh something on. And in a lot of ways, the child is sort of like the fulcrum that's at the center of the scale. And where the child is born, that sort of natural endowment that the child has that may be the result of their genes or things that happened for better or for worse prenatally, really determines where the fulcrum might be set. And then you can think about the experiences that the child has in life as being related to kind of the arms of the balance on which the fulcrum is set. And so, although sometimes we're tempted to think, well, maybe resilience is just something that's born in the child, or you either have it or you don't, really, the reason that a scale is useful is because you can think about negative experiences as really kind of weighing the child down, and positive experiences as kind of helping to counterbalance that and moving things in a positive direction. And just like with a scale, the more weights that you put on one side will determine the way that it tips. Similarly with children, really the balance of experiences, positive and negative, help to determine how things go. Now, remember, if the child is the fulcrum, the child may start out kind of more towards the negative side or more towards the positive side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively. We also understand that, children, in terms of the fulcrum itself, they might have a kind of a pointy base and be very easily moved by these kinds of experiences, or maybe some of the factors that we see in children might lead them to have more of a flat base to that fulcrum, where events are going to have less kind of an effect on how much they move. And there's some indication that there may be some genetic factors that children are born with that really determine how pointy versus flat the fulcrum is. But the good news is that subsequent experiences can help not only balance the scale, but can also help move where the fulcrum is, so that different kinds of events can then influence how much it's moving up or down. And I want to be clear that the kinds of experiences that we're talking about that are positive, we sometimes talk about these as effectiveness factors. They're things that communities can produce that can really make a difference. They're not definitely just something within the child, and they're not necessarily even just something within the family. Certainly families can have effectiveness factors in terms of strong relationships with their children, a lot of responsiveness to the child's need, high rates of what we call serve and return. But in addition, communities can provide these kinds of effectiveness factors by having strong early learning environments, by having good health care, both prenatal maternal care and early life care for children. There are any number of other things. Good libraries can be a resiliency factor. They can help with the effectiveness of making the scale move more in a kind of a positive direction. So all of these things really contribute to resilience. And what's nice about that is that there's a tremendous amount that communities and policymakers can do to help promote resilience. It's not some magical quality. It's really something that we all can contribute to. And that to the extent that we're doing that, we're really contributing to the prosperity of our whole society. We're helping children, but we're really making so that everybody benefits more, because it makes for people who are more able to deal with difficulties that subsequently come up.
You can imagine if you were able to channel Phil into multiple places in your community where people need to understand the shaping influence of place, they can walk away and they can think about that. They can think about that scale. It becomes an embodied thing. They can think about what communities do to tip it in the right direction. And just as important, it inoculates against the swamp. It makes it hard to have swampy thinking. So this is about breaking their machines. It not only replaces them with something, but it makes it difficult to go back into the swamp. Scales don't tip themselves. It sounds absurd, right? But people have a very hard time getting willpower into the scales story. Family bubble, there's too much space to fill. So people have a tendency when there are parts of a thing, they have to assign definition to that. We have a metaphor that's about tables and levelness. People feel compelled to describe what each leg of the table is. So here they might say, well, the family bubble is in there, the family's in there, but now they have a lot of other things that they have to deal with. Stress does the body good, they're not going to say that when they're thinking about the scale. So you can see determinism, that fulcrum moving, gets at that. So it's not just that metaphors are clever. It's that the right metaphor actually solves problems for you that you have in swampy thinking. It seeps in, it solves these problems, it gets people thinking in the right direction.
The question is, why do some children do well even under difficult circumstances?
A scale of positive influences and negative influences. And so if you have a family, or a child who's growing up where the scales are tipped down really low, meaning a really heavy, scale or weight on that side in terms of negative, what are the positive things that can help them, sort of as like outside influences?
What can I do to counterbalance the child's life?
And certainly one way to promote resiliency is to provide positive relationships or positive role models or some way to sort of counterbalance the negative.
Even if the child is having problems at home, at least the child can go to school knowing that this child is going to be exposed to a positive influence. So that's where the counterbalance lies.
It sort of like comes into the concept of like the fulcrum and where it stands in order to have, but you could have somebody that has just like one negative experience that we may think is relatively simple or not that bad or whatever, that may like totally tip the scale negative, and you may need like 100 positive things to counterbalance that.
What kind of comes to mind is that, if a child is, maybe comes from a background or an environment where there's drugs or abuse or stress, that obviously maybe they wouldn't do well, but if there's something like extra on the positive side, like an after-school program or a good school system where they have good supports, that the student would, if that student who is on the negative side had access to community activities or whatever, or even just other, mentors, that they would do better, in the case of adversity.
You want them to be ready to hear what you have to say and to talk about programs and transformation. But they can't get there unless they have these building blocks, unless they have enough mechanism that you can engage them in the conversation. And so communication becomes an explanatory tool. It becomes an obligation you have to be talking to people and explaining to them all the way along, not just when you want them to come in and come on board with your program. And so what this does in the factor stacking outcome scale is to fill in yet another part of this story. So stories are modular. You can pull parts of this and tell it in different ways. And we are still adding to this story. So every year we work with the Harvard Center and with other groups who say we want to be able to talk about neglect. We want to be able to talk about plasticity. We go out into the swamp and come back and test things and add to this story. I want to end by saying that the people that you see, like Phil and Jack and others, didn't just become excellent communicators. They weren't sort of born that way. They thought a lot and spent a lot of time learning how to communicate in a different way. So these are some of the things that we offer. Obviously, other people offer other kinds of things, but so Jack and all of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child members have gone through numerous spokesperson trainings. We'll do another one this December to update them on how the core story is evolving. They practice in front of cameras. They take questions and figure out how they're going to respond to those using the metaphors and the frame elements. So it's not just that you are a born communicator, a born framer, but rather it's learning a skill and becoming tactical in how you're going to think about deploying these frame elements. But when you do, it becomes a facilitator of social change. So I want to show you just two little quick interviews with folks from Alberta who have learned the core story of early child development and talk about what it's done to their practice.
Toxic stress has become a run-of-the-mill concept. Brain architecture, serve and return. These are things that now when we sit down around a table and discuss interdepartmental initiatives to help improve outcomes for youth in the long term are standard fare. And we don't have to explain it. When somebody says brain architecture, people say, oh, I know what that means, and they can just contribute to the discussion. So I think we have a common language that has made it much, much easier to move the agenda forward to help impact longer-term outcomes for the better for our youth.
We were already working on projects that needed the brain development aspect fleshed out quite a lot. But what I didn't have and what the symposium provided was a package that brought all of those pieces together in a very, very useful way. And then to top it all off, frameworks helped me to talk about it. How to articulate my message to funders, to students, to audiences that are very, very diverse.
I think what's important about this is that they are not seeing communications as something they do to other people. It's something that they are always doing with each other. It is a co-construction. And so it's not, oh, now let me think about that frame element that I'm going to use as I go out into community. But it's walking the talk internally. It's using the language that you develop with each other so that it becomes, second nature. And then the other people that you engage as you go along, it becomes more natural. So I want to end just with my sort of plea for rethinking communications and why it is important that the world needs you to be telling different stories in the public square. And first, because the stories we are telling ourselves are often inaccurate, and there are very few other people engaging ordinary citizens in rethinking those inaccurate stories. Because as Susan said at the top of the day, the laws that we enact embody these mistaken cultural models. We write them into our legislation and we then monitor them and count the things that are part of the dominant paradigm. Because our fellow citizens need new stories if they're going to decipher complex phenomena, if they're going to make better decisions in their own lives, but also in their lives as citizens. Because the obstacles to comprehension are hardwired. This is not about standing up and making a few little notations, but it's about getting in front of people over time and growing new connections for people. So this is the brain science brought back upon us. Because we have the opportunity to access places where people learn stories. So all of you are sitting on top of places where people, you have their attention, you have the ability to talk to them about their children, about children in the community. And so this is a real asset, is to help them rethink the stories they already know. And because we have scientifically accurate, high compelling stories to tell, the neuroscience is very, very solid. And so I hope that these will all be things that inspire you to take seriously your job as explanatory communicators and to see that as part of the job that you do as you go forward with this new initiative.